Christopher, a highly respected CEO, had been invited by Samuel, a real estate billionaire, to a lavish dinner celebrating his 70th birthday. He arrived at the party accompanied by his father, Paul, an 80-year-old man of humble means but rich life experience. Among the guests was Amanda, Samuel's haughty niece, who the moment she laid eyes on Paul, judged him harshly for his appearance. In front of everyone, she sneered, suggesting that he should be serving the guests rather than sitting at the table. Calm and wise, Paul replied softly but firmly, "Young lady, you should have more manners." This only fueled Amanda's anger, and she erupted, screaming at Paul, "You have to learn your place here," before slapping him across the face. The room fell into stunned silence, and Christopher rushed to his father's side, alarm and fury mingling in his eyes. In that tense moment, Samuel stepped forward, revealing to Amanda that Paul was not only a guest but the father of Christopher, the new majority partner in the family business. Shocked, Amanda froze, but her arrogance remained intact. The seed of vengeance was planted in Christopher's mind, and from that instant, he began to meticulously plan how to turn the tables on Amanda, ensuring she would face the consequences of her cruelty. But what exactly did Christopher do next? How did he orchestrate his intricate plan for justice and redemption? The story is far from over, filled with cunning moves, unexpected twists, and powerful lessons about dignity and respect. But before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's see how this story really began. The grand ballroom shimmered under the soft golden glow of crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off the polished marble floors and the glittering gowns of the city's elite. Laughter and conversation mingled in a harmonious hum until the sharp, sudden sound of a hand meeting flesh fractured the evening's illusion of refinement. A gasp rippled through the room, like a wave disturbing still water. Amanda stood over Paul, her hand still suspended mid-air, a cruel smirk twisting her lips, eyes alight with a sense of misplaced authority. "You have to learn your place here," she shrieked, her voice cutting through the soft music and chatter, leaving a trail of stunned silence in its wake. Paul staggered, blinking through the sudden sting, trying to compose himself. His body, though frail with age, still carried a quiet dignity that no slap could erase. He clasped his hands to his chest instinctively, not out of fear alone, but from a lifetime of being underestimated, dismissed, and looked down upon. The room's eyes darted between him and the socialite, whispering judgments that floated like butterflies around the edges of the gathering. Christopher froze mid-step across the room, the polished shoes of his designer tuxedo pressing against the gleaming marble as his father faltered. For the briefest heartbeat, the composed CEO vanished, replaced by a son who had always seen his father as a protector, now watching him become a victim. Adrenaline surged through him, sharp and electrifying. Without hesitation, he sprinted across the room, weaving through the shocked guests, his heart hammering not from fear of confrontation, but from the raw, visceral need to protect the man who had given him everything. "Dad, are you okay?" His voice trembled with a cocktail of fear, anger, and an unspoken fury that simmered beneath a veneer of composure. Samuel, the family's patriarch and host of the evening, stepped forward, his usual confident demeanor faltering as his face paled. "Amanda, what have you done?" His voice wavered between disbelief and embarrassment, reverberating across the ornate room. Amanda, unbothered by decorum, rolled her eyes, adjusting the diamond bracelet that caught the chandelier light like a miniature sun. "I'm teaching the help some manners, Uncle." "He was insolent," she said, each word dripping with contempt and an assumed superiority that made the blood in the room chill. Samuel's hand gripped the microphone tightly, knuckles whitening. "Amanda, this man is not the help. This is Paul, the father of Christopher, the new majority partner in our family's company. His words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, cutting through the elegance like a scalpel. The room seemed to hold its breath, the collective shock palpable, hearts skipping as the social hierarchy fractured in an instant. Amanda froze, her laughter faltering as she took in the figure of Christopher, standing tall, eyes gleaming with intelligence and a quiet, terrifying calm. Her mind raced, but instead of retreating, her lips curled into a cruel, high-pitched laugh that betrayed her disbelief. Him? A partner? Well, looking at his father, I assume it's a diversity hire. Someone has to sweep the floors, right? The words, venomous and ignorant, hung in the air like smoke, sickeningly bold. Christopher's hand remained gentle as he guided his father to a velvet sofa, checking the swollen cheek and the redness blossoming on his skin. His touch was careful, reverent, as though cradling the most fragile treasure. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. Instead, he exuded a calm that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. It was the calm of someone who had absorbed every insult, every slight, every injustice, and was now ready to channel that energy into something far more powerful than rage. He straightened his jacket, his eyes locking with Amanda's, letting the silence between them speak louder than any words could. The room, still in stunned silence, began to murmur. Guests shifted uncomfortably, caught between the spectacle and the unspoken understanding that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Samuel, torn between family loyalty and societal appearances, looked helplessly at the pair, father and son bound by love, by history, and now by the undeniable moment of revelation. Paul's hand, resting lightly on his son's arm, conveyed unspoken reassurance, a steadying presence that spoke of resilience cultivated through decades of quiet endurance. Amanda's smirk faltered as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. She had thought she wielded control, that her wealth and social standing could shield her from consequence. Instead, she faced the unwavering gaze of a son who would not let injustice stand, and a father whose dignity could not be erased by arrogance or ignorance. Christopher's calmness was a storm beneath still waters, and it radiated in waves that unsettled every guest, forcing them to recognize the fragility of the social masks they had all worn so carefully. In that moment, the gala became more than a celebration. It became a stage where power, respect, and human decency collided. The echoes of the slap reverberated not just against marble walls, but against the very foundations of entitlement and prejudice that Amanda had taken for granted. And as Christopher's eyes met his father's, the silent understanding between them was palpable, an unspoken vow that injustice would not go unanswered, that dignity would not be violated without consequence, and that love, quiet yet formidable, would guide their path forward. The private suite upstairs felt insulated from the chaos below. Yet the echoes of what had happened lingered in the air like a bruise that refused to fade. The door clicked shut, sealing them inside a space of soft lighting, velvet drapes, and muffled music that now sounded distant and unreal. Christopher stood close to his father, gently pressing an ice pack against Paul's cheek. His hand was steady, but his jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. "I'm canceling the deal, Dad," Christopher said, his voice low but vibrating with barely restrained fury. "We're leaving. Tonight. And I swear to you, I will destroy Samuel's company for allowing this." He turned away, unable to look at the swelling on his father's face for too long. He began pacing the room, long strides cutting sharp lines across the carpet, like a caged tiger searching for a way out. Every step carried years of buried anger, memories of insults swallowed, doors closed quietly, opportunities denied with polite smiles. His fists clenched and unclenched as if testing how much damage they could do. Paul sat calmly on the velvet sofa, his posture relaxed despite the pain radiating through his jaw. He watched his son with a gaze filled not with fear, but with a deep, patient understanding. Slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. "No, son," Paul said gently. "That is exactly what she wants." Christopher stopped mid-step, his chest rising and falling sharply. Paul continued, his voice steady, measured, shaped by decades of restraint. "She wants you to lose control. She wants proof that we are what she believes they're emotional, unstable, unfit to belong in her world." Paul managed a small smile, though it pulled painfully at his swollen lip. The smile wasn't for show, it was for his son. "You have a good heart, Christopher. That's always been your strength. But tonight, you need to use your head, not your fists." He paused, letting the words settle. Justice isn't about noise. It's about results. The room grew quiet. Christopher stood frozen, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. He hated the calm in Paul's voice, hated that his father had learned to speak through pain instead of against it. He hated most of all that Paul was right. Memories flooded him uninvited. He saw his father coming home late, shoulders slumped, hands rough and tired. He remembered overhearing insults disguised as jokes, seeing Paul nod politely while being spoken to like he was invisible. He remembered watching his father choose dignity over confrontation again and again. Because there were bills to pay, a child to raise, and no room for pride if it threatened survival. Christopher inhaled deeply, then again, forcing the fire in his chest to settle into something colder, sharper. He straightened, the CEO resurfacing beneath the sun's rage. Strategy replaced instinct. Precision replaced impulse. "I hate seeing you like this," Christopher said quietly, his back still turned. "I hate that you had to endure any of it ever." Paul's eyes softened. "I endured it so you wouldn't have to," he replied. "So you could choose differently." Christopher nodded once. He moved toward the balcony and slid the glass door open. Cool night air washed over him, grounding him. Below, the garden party continued as if nothing had happened. Soft lights glowed among trimmed hedges and white roses. Guests laughed, glasses clinked. And there, near the fountains, stood Amanda. She was laughing loudly, surrounded by friends, her posture loose with confidence. Christopher watched as she mimicked the way Paul had stumbled, exaggerating the motion for effect. Her friends burst into laughter, unbothered, untouched by consequence. The sight hollowed something deep inside him. He didn't feel rage anymore. He felt clarity. This wasn't just about a slap. It was about power wielded without accountability, about humiliation mistaken for entitlement, about a woman who believed the world would always bend to protect her cruelty. Christopher reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He glanced back once at his father, who met his gaze with quiet trust. No words were exchanged, but everything was understood. He turned back toward the night and dialed a number he knew by heart. "I need a full forensic audit," Christopher said when the line connected, his voice calm, precise. Everything tied to Amanda. Not the family trust, her personal finances, shell companies, off-the-books accounts. I want it all. There was a pause on the other end. "How soon?" the voice asked. "Tonight," Christopher replied. "I want the first thread pulled before the sun comes up." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. For the first time since the slap, his shoulders relaxed. The fire hadn't disappeared. It had transformed. Behind him, Paul closed his eyes for a moment, breathing through the pain, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. Not loud, not defiant, just steady and real. Father and son stood separated by glass and distance, yet bound by something unbreakable. What had been taken from them downstairs would not be reclaimed with violence, but with intelligence, patience, and dignity. And in that quiet resolve, the first step toward justice had already been taken. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the boardroom, casting long, pale rectangles of light across the polished mahogany table. The city below stirred with the usual hum of business, but inside, the air was thick with tension. Christopher arrived early, his steps measured, precise. The sharp click of his shoes against the hardwood echoing faintly in the otherwise quiet room. His mind was already in motion, calculating, observing, anticipating. Samuel sat at the head of the table, looking smaller than usual in his tailored suit. The apologies had already begun as soon as Christopher entered, his uncle's voice heavy with embarrassment. "Christopher, I can't express enough how sorry I am for what happened last night." It was. Christopher raised a hand, stopping him. The gesture was calm, almost casual, but there was a gravity in his expression that immediately silenced the room. "Business is business, Samuel," he said softly, his voice even, deliberate. "But character, that's a liability." His eyes, sharp and icy, swept across the room, freezing the whispers that fluttered like restless birds. There was no anger in his tone, only the measured weight of consequence. The quiet authority of someone who understood how power could be wielded with precision rather than force. The door burst open before Samuel could reply, and Amanda stormed in, her heels clacking loudly against the floor, echoing like an accusation. She threw her designer purse onto the table with a dramatic flourish. "Why are we having a meeting about yesterday?" she demanded, her voice pitched high with indignation. It was a misunderstanding. The old man looked like a waiter. Her eyes deliberately avoided Christopher's gaze, as though the sight of him would reveal the consequences she was desperate to deny. Her words hung in the air, sharp but hollow. The room shifted, glances exchanged between board members, some flinching, some suppressing smiles, sensing the tension beneath the surface. Christopher's lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unchanging, a mask of composed calculation. He reached across the table slowly and slid a sleek, black folder toward her, the soft thud resonating like a warning. The gesture was quiet, almost understated, but it carried an electric charge. "Actually, Amanda," he said, his voice smooth, calm, and yet carrying an undeniable edge. "We're here to discuss the charity gala you are organizing next week. The one for underprivileged children." Amanda blinked, a flicker of irritation crossing her features. "That is my project." "You have no say," she shot back, her tone sharp and defensive, as if trying to reclaim some perceived authority. Christopher smiled, then a dangerous, charming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the smile of someone who had seen the cracks beneath the surface and was ready to exploit them, but with elegance. "I do now," he said quietly. "As a partner, I reviewed the ledger. Why are there $500,000 in consulting fees paid to a shell company registered in your boyfriend's name?" The room went utterly silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. Faces paled, chairs creaked as some shifted nervously, and Amanda's skin flushed crimson. She opened her mouth, searching desperately for a response, any explanation that could salvage the situation. It's for logistics," she stammered, her voice trembling slightly despite her best effort to remain authoritative. Samuel's eyebrows knitted in suspicion. His eyes, previously soft with apology, now narrowed as he leaned back in his chair, a silent witness to the unraveling. Christopher, tapping his pen lightly against the polished surface, exuded an almost theatrical calm. "I'll let it slide. Yeah. For now," he said, the words soft but deliberate, each syllable weighted with implied consequence. "In fact," he added, a subtle smile curling his lips, "I want to co-host the gala with you, to show there are no hard feelings." Amanda's eyes narrowed, the flicker of doubt passing behind her carefully applied makeup. She sensed the trap, the quiet, inexorable tightening of the noose. Yet her pride and the illusion of control forced her to nod. "Fine," she said, her voice brittle with tension. She believed she had emerged unscathed, victorious even, unaware of the depth of the web Christopher was already weaving. As she gathered her papers and swept out of the room with a dramatic flourish, Christopher leaned toward Samuel, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Let her think she's safe," he murmured, his eyes cold yet tinged with subtle satisfaction. "It makes the fall harder." Samuel exhaled slowly, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. He had underestimated his nephew's cunning, had assumed that anger would be its own punishment, but what Christopher wielded was far more formidable. Strategy, patience, the quiet intelligence of a son who had learned to transform humiliation into calculated power. Christopher returned to the window, looking out at the city below. The world seemed ordinary, unchanged, yet in that very normalcy lay the perfect cover for what was to come. He felt a strange clarity, a mix of sorrow for his father's suffering, resolve for justice, and a growing quiet excitement at the thought of restoring balance without letting emotion dictate the outcome. He glanced back at the empty chair where Amanda had sat, already imagining the threads he would pull, the dominoes set to fall. But he also looked at Samuel, whose uncertain expression carried a blend of relief and apprehension. And beyond that, in the warmth of his chest, he felt the presence of his father Paul's dignity, strength, and patience guiding every decision. A silent hand on his shoulder, reminding him that justice was a matter of intellect, not spectacle. Christopher's smile faded into thoughtful calm. The first thread had been laid, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was only the beginning. The week before, the gala stretched out for Christopher like an unending corridor, each day a test of patience and self-control. From the moment he woke until the late hours of the night, he lived in a paradoxical space, one foot in civility, the other in quiet, simmering calculation. Every interaction with Amanda demanded a careful balance between charm and authority. He sent her flowers, not as an offering of peace, but as a mask of civility. Delicate arrangements of pale roses and lilies meant to lull her into believing that he had forgiven, that he had let go. He praised her organizational skills in the press, his words polished, public, and seemingly genuine, dripping with a sweetness that was almost painful to watch. Every smile, every compliment, every gesture was a calculated kindness, a dagger wrapped in silk. Paul observed his son with an expression that blended pride and unease. He had witnessed Christopher's temper flare and ebb in the past, but this week demanded more than controlled anger. It demanded patience, discipline, a restraint that cut deeper than any blow could. "Be careful, Chris," Paul said one evening as they reviewed schedules for the upcoming event. "When you wrestle with pigs, you get dirty." Christopher looked up from the papers strewn across the table, meeting his father's gaze. His expression softened, and he crossed the room in a few brisk steps to embrace him. "I'm not wrestling, Dad," he whispered, the warmth of his voice contradicting the icy precision that had begun to dominate his demeanor. "I'm building a pen." Paul chuckled softly, though worry still lingered in the furrows of his brow. "Just make sure it holds, son," he murmured, letting his hand rest briefly on Christopher's shoulder. As the days passed, Christopher immersed himself in quiet reconnaissance, observing Amanda's movements with the precision of a strategist. One evening, while scanning through the gala plans under the guise of casual review, he discovered something that set his mind alight with both opportunity and inevitability. Amanda was planning to announce her engagement to the wealthy son of a senator. Her ambition to secure her social position and elevate her status through this alliance was a critical vulnerability. It was the leverage he needed, the thread he could pull to unravel her carefully constructed image. He began speaking with the catering staff, arranging meetings under the pretense of finalizing menu details. Many of them, particularly those who had been quietly marginalized or intimidated for years, opened up to him willingly. They spoke of Amanda's temper, her disdainful comments, The way she had screamed at servers, dismissed concerns, or used her wealth to humiliate anyone who challenged her. Every story was another thread in a tapestry of abuse and entitlement. And Christopher listened with the steady patience of someone stitching together justice. He absorbed each detail with the meticulous care of a craftsman, taking mental notes, remembering names, times, the subtle ways she demeaned those around her. The trust they offered him was humbling. It reminded him why dignity and respect mattered more than power and titles. Each night, as he returned to the suite, he would sit with his father, sharing pieces of the day not as gossip, but as insight. Paul would nod, his eyes reflecting both concern and pride. "You're patient, Chris. Remember, the smallest leak can sink a ship if left unattended," he would say. His voice calm, guiding, the wisdom of decades compressed into a few measured words. Christopher absorbed it all, allowing each lesson to sharpen the plan forming in his mind. The morning of the gala arrived with a deceptive serenity. The city streets below were already alive with the hum of traffic, unaware of the storm poised to erupt in a few short hours. Christopher's phone rang, and when he saw Amanda's name flashing on the screen, his grip tightened reflexively. He could feel the tension vibrating through his fingers, through his chest, but his voice remained controlled, smooth as he answered. "Make sure your father doesn't come tonight," Amanda said, her tone clipped, commanding. "We don't want him ruining the aesthetic." Her words were laced with condescension, but beneath them Christopher sensed a tremor, a subtle strain that betrayed her own anxiety. He gripped the phone just enough for the edges to dig into his palm, the pressure a small reminder of the fire simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Don't worry, Amanda," he replied evenly, each syllable deliberate. "Tonight will be picture perfect." He hung up and placed the phone gently on the table, exhaling slowly. There was a quiet satisfaction in the control he had exerted, control that masked a storm of preparation, meticulous and inexorable. He walked to the balcony, looking down at the city bathed in morning light, the streets alive with unaware passers-by. He thought of his father, of the trust and patience that had shaped him, of the quiet dignity that Paul had always insisted on maintaining even in the face of humiliation. That dignity was now the compass guiding his actions. Christopher glanced at the mirror reflecting the room behind him, his reflection sharp, composed, yet eyes burning with a quiet, potent intensity. He felt a strange mixture of anticipation and reverence for the justice he would deliver, for the dignity he would restore, and for the subtle artistry of timing. The gala was no longer just an event. It was the stage upon which all truths would be revealed, a theater where kindness and patience would outmaneuver arrogance and cruelty. He sat for a moment, letting the silence fill him, centering himself for what lay ahead. Each detail mattered, each interaction a thread in a delicate web of consequence. By the end of the night, Amanda's facade would crumble, but it would not be through chaos or anger. It would be through the quiet, unwavering logic of a son protecting his father and a man wielding dignity as both shield and sword. Christopher rose, adjusted his jacket, and allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to grace his lips. The pieces were in motion. The trap was set. And he knew, with the certainty of a heart that had learned patience and the wisdom of restraint, that tonight justice would be executed not in fury, but in grace. The grand ballroom was a symphony of opulence, each detail meticulously curated to convey wealth, elegance, and exclusivity. Gold streamers hung from the ceiling like threads of sunlight captured in crystal, reflecting off towering champagne fountains that spilled bubbly in perfect, cascading arcs. The city's elite, adorned in gowns and tuxedos, moved through the room like pieces on a chessboard, exchanging polite laughter and hollow compliments, their eyes flitting toward the spectacle of power and privilege. The air was heavy with perfume, cologne, and anticipation, Yet beneath the veneer of civility, tension coiled like a silent serpent, unseen but palpable. Amanda stood near the center, radiant in a white gown that hugged her form like liquid silk. Every detail, the embroidery, the subtle shimmer of diamonds along her neckline, the precision of her hair screamed perfection, control, and carefully rehearsed benevolence. She moved among the guests with practiced grace, greeting each with a warm smile that failed to mask the sharp glint in her eyes. Her laughter, measured and musical, carried an undertone of superiority, a subtle reminder that she was the queen of this kingdom. Beneath the elegance, she radiated entitlement, expecting admiration and deference from all who dared to share her space. Christopher entered shortly after, his presence a quiet disruption to the orchestrated perfection of the evening. Beside him walked Paul, whose custom tuxedo seemed to transform him. It was more than fabric, it was a symbol of dignity restored. The way he held himself, head high, shoulders squared, eyes warm and alive, radiated a quiet authority that no opulent gown or chandelier could replicate. He greeted guests with genuine warmth, shaking hands, offering smiles that carried empathy and honesty. There was a humility in his interactions that made people pause, even those who prided themselves on sophistication and social rank. The contrast was stark, unavoidable. Guests lingered a moment longer, captivated by his authenticity, murmuring appreciatively to each other. The air seemed to shift. Whispers of admiration replaced the hollow chatter Amanda relied upon to validate herself. Amanda's eyes, trained to detect attention like a hawk, caught the shift instantly. Her smile faltered, the delicate balance of charm and control she had cultivated for years beginning to crack. Her guests, instead of focusing on her carefully rehearsed poise, were drawn to Paul. The man she had dismissed, the man she believed beneath her. A flash of fury crossed her features, quick and lethal, masked momentarily by the elegant tilt of her chin. Unable to tolerate losing the spotlight, Amanda moved toward the stage ahead of schedule. She tapped the microphone with precision, the clink echoing across the polished floor, demanding attention. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice high but firm, practiced to convey warmth and benevolence. "It's so good to see so many civilized people here tonight." Her eyes swept the room, stopping on Paul, lingering with thinly veiled venom. She began her speech, painting herself as a savior, a benevolent force dedicated to helping the less fortunate. Her words, carefully crafted and rehearsed, were meant to inspire admiration, to solidify her image as a philanthropist beyond reproach. Yet beneath the carefully polished rhetoric, there was a tremor, a subtle tension in her fingers that betrayed unease. Christopher lingered in the shadows, his eyes fixed on the stage, checking his watch. He did not speak, did not move unnecessarily. Every breath, every slight adjustment of his stance was measured, intentional. 3:2:1. He whispered softly to himself, the countdown carried in the steadiness of his heart rather than aloud, as if he were the calm before a storm. Suddenly, the large screen behind Amanda flickered, the intended images of smiling children replaced by something entirely unexpected. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector's focus shifted. A video appeared, capturing Amanda in her private domain just hours before, screaming at a maid. The words were vile, laced with racist invective, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding. Her gestures were violent, a vase smashed against a wall with reckless fury, shards scattering across the floor. The audio boomed through the speakers, filling the room with a stark, undeniable truth. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, the sound mingling with the clinking of glasses and the sudden, sharp intake of breath. Faces turned, eyes wide, jaws slackening in disbelief. Amanda herself spun toward the screen, horror painting her features with raw, unguarded emotion. The careful mask of poise slipped, leaving exposed the vulnerability she had never intended to reveal. "Turn it off! Turn it off!" she screamed, her hands flailing toward the projector lens, trying desperately to erase the evidence of her own cruelty. "It's a deep fake. It's not real." The words, frantic and trembling, betrayed a panic she could not contain, betraying a fragility that no gown, no jewelry, no social standing could hide. Guests murmured in shock, their admiration replaced by confusion, anger, and disbelief. Amanda's carefully constructed world began to fracture before their eyes. The performance she had cultivated, the illusion of generosity and control, collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. In that instant, the ballroom ceased to be a stage for her, and became instead a mirror, reflecting every choice, every word, every cruelty she had thought hidden. Christopher watched quietly from the shadows, his heart steady, his mind clear. He allowed a small, controlled exhale, letting the tension of anticipation give way to the satisfaction of inevitability. This was not vengeance. It was justice executed with precision, patience, and dignity. He could see the weight of realization pressing upon Amanda, her eyes darting to friends, to family, to the senator's son who now looked on in shocked silence, unable to ignore the truth laid bare before him. Paul, standing slightly behind his son, allowed himself a quiet smile, not one of triumph over someone else, but one of relief and affirmation. His dignity, his patience, his lifetime of endurance had not been in vain. The room, once a fortress of privilege and entitlement, had shifted. And in that shift, Christopher and Paul were not just observers. They were the architects of a reckoning that would be remembered long after the evening ended. Christopher stepped forward, his movements deliberate, calm, and impossibly controlled. The soft click of his polished shoes against the stage floor seemed to echo louder than the murmurs of the crowd. Amanda's trembling hands clutched the microphone, her knuckles white against the cold metal, and for a moment she seemed suspended in disbelief, caught between instinct and panic. Christopher reached out with quiet authority, gently taking the microphone from her fingers. She flinched as if burned, yet her eyes never left his, wide with a mix of fear and fury. "It's not a fake, Amanda," Christopher said softly, yet every syllable carried the weight of certainty. The calm authority of a man who had prepared for this moment meticulously. His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the attendees one by one, letting the truth settle like an unshakable weight, and neither is this. With a subtle nod, he signaled to the large screen behind them. The images shifted, the cheerful, idealized photos of charity events replaced by columns of numbers, spreadsheets, and official bank statements. The glow of the projector illuminated the room in harsh clarity, bathing faces in cold, revealing light. Every eye turned to the screen, every conversation silenced by the undeniable facts displayed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Christopher continued, his voice steady, authoritative, imbued with the quiet power of someone who understood the responsibility of wielding truth. "You donated millions to this foundation, millions meant to feed starving children, to provide shelter, education, and hope." His eyes flicked toward Amanda, her perfectly painted face beginning to crack under the pressure, the first tremors of vulnerability showing through her carefully maintained facade. "But as you can see, 80% of those funds were siphoned off to pay off Amanda's gambling debts in Las Vegas and Monaco." A ripple of shock moved through the audience. Gasps, murmurs, and sharp intakes of breath replaced the polite laughter and clinking of glasses that had filled the room just moments before. Faces turned toward Amanda in disbelief. The senator's son, her fiancé, who had been beaming moments ago, froze in place. His hands shook slightly as he opened his jacket, removing the engagement ring box from his pocket. He examined it briefly, then slowly closed it again, returning it to his jacket with a look of disgust and disillusionment. The warmth and excitement in his eyes were replaced by betrayal and revulsion. Amanda's composure crumbled completely. Tears welled up in her eyes, rolling down her cheeks as she raised her trembling hands to her face. She pitched her voice, high-pitched and quivering, attempting to evoke sympathy, to rewrite reality in the eyes of those around her. He hacked me. He's trying to frame me because I'm a woman. Uncle Samuel, do something. Somebody stop him. Her voice broke, oscillating between hysteria and anger. And her body seemed smaller, the once commanding presence reduced to fear and desperation. Samuel, standing off to the side, looked at his niece with heartache. His eyes were filled with sorrow, the kind that comes from loving someone and witnessing the painful consequences of their choices. He stepped forward, moving toward the center of the room with slow, measured steps, his expression firm, resolute. "I didn't want to believe it, Amanda," he said softly, yet each word cut through the room like steel. "But Christopher showed me the proof this morning. You stole from starving children to buy jewelry." His gaze did not waver, holding her accountable in a way words alone rarely could. Amanda wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, but her face hardened instantly. The soft vulnerability replaced by a mask of cold, calculated malice. She looked around, her eyes flashing with defiance and desperation, clinging to the last remnants of power she believed she still held. "So what?" she spat, her voice sharp and dripping with disdain. "I'm the heir. You can't touch me. The bylaws say only a unanimous vote can remove a family member, and I have my mother's proxy vote." Her smirk was cruel, triumphant in its naivety, as she imagined herself surviving this storm unscathed. Christopher's expression did not change. His calm remained unshaken, the kind of calm that comes from understanding every angle, every loophole, every possibility, and having a plan to close them all. He allowed her a few heartbeats of illusion, letting the tension in the room swell, letting the audience absorb the magnitude of her deceit and audacity. Behind the icy exterior, his heart raced not with anger, but with resolve. The next steps had to be precise, measured, and absolute. The crowd's attention shifted subtly, some still caught in the initial shock of her misdeeds, others scanning Christopher with the recognition that the young man who had seemed so composed, so calculating, was now delivering justice with dignity and quiet power. Paul, standing just off stage, watched his son with a mix of awe and relief, recognizing the culmination of patience, strategy, and moral clarity. Every story he had taught Christopher, every lesson in endurance, empathy, and judgment had led to this moment. Amanda's defiance had begun to falter, just imperceptibly, the first cracks appearing in her armor. Yet she clung to the last threads of control, determined to convince herself and perhaps the room that she remained untouchable. But the truth, as Christopher had prepared meticulously, was inexorable, undeniable, and poised to dismantle every carefully constructed lie she had ever believed would protect her. In that charged moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, a suspended space between illusion and reality. Every eye, every subtle movement, every whispered intake of breath carried the weight of impending revelation. Christopher's voice, calm and measured, echoed quietly over the murmurs, a steady anchor in the storm. The second twist had been revealed, but the crescendo of justice, the moment where consequences would align with moral truth, was still to come. And in that delicate balance, hope, dignity, and resolve hovered, ready to reshape the lives of everyone in the room. The air in the ballroom had shifted entirely. Where moments ago there had been polite murmurs of shock and whispers of gossip, now there was a tangible buzz of outrage. Guests leaned toward one another, their voices trembling with disbelief and indignation. Sporsations that had been elegant and rehearsed minutes earlier were now raw, spontaneous, and pointed. Refunds were quietly, then more insistently demanded. The illusion of civility had shattered, replaced by the acute awareness that the facade they had observed for years was nothing more than carefully constructed artifice. Amanda stood in the middle of it all, still in her pristine white gown, the hem brushing the polished floor. her expression defiant even as cracks began to etch themselves across her carefully curated mask. Her hands rested on her hips, fingers slightly trembling, not with fear, but with a stubborn, almost feral determination to cling to the semblance of power she had long cultivated. Her eyes were narrow slits of anger, darting from guest to guest, reading their astonishment as a challenge. She leveled her gaze at Christopher, who had remained calm throughout the unfolding revelation, his posture controlled and upright, his eyes steady and unyielding. "You think you're smart," she hissed, her voice low but carrying the sharp edge of venom. "But this is my family's building. Get out! Take your peasant father and get out!" The words were meant to wound, to assert dominance. But the audience now heard not the confidence of an heiress, but the trembling, desperate echo of someone clinging to a crumbling world. Christopher's sigh was soft, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of measured patience and genuine pity. He turned his head slightly, letting his gaze sweep over her, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together in a vain attempt at control, the quiver in her chin. "I really hoped you would show some remorse, Amanda," he said gently, the quiet firmness of his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I wanted to believe people could change." His words were neither accusation nor triumph. They were an invitation, a mirror reflecting the path she could have taken and the choices she had rejected. "I don't need to change for you," she spat, her voice harsh, defiant, but tinged with the unsteady undercurrent of someone realizing the ground beneath them is no longer secure. The words sounded hollow in the opulent space, a fragile shield against the truth that surrounded her. Christopher nodded toward his lawyer, seated in the front row with a composed demeanor. The gesture was almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of orchestration and authority. "You're right about the bylaws, Amanda. You can't be removed from the board easily," he acknowledged, his tone even, almost conversational, as if explaining a simple fact to a child. However, he allowed the pause to linger just long enough for the audience to lean in, curiosity and tension building, the weight of anticipation pressing against every shoulder in the room. He extended a hand and pointed deliberately toward the walls of the ballroom, the gesture precise and commanding attention. "You forgot to pay the mortgage on the estate to cover your tracks. The bank put the deed up for auction this morning at 9 a.m. His voice remained calm, soft even, yet every word resonated with unassailable authority, each syllable dropping into the collective consciousness of the crowd like a pebble in a still pond, rippling outward in waves of shock and revelation. Amanda's face lost all color. The stark pallor that overtook her cheeks was more than fear, it was disbelief, horror, the beginning of comprehension that her carefully built fortress of privilege had been dismantled while she slept under the illusion of security. "No, that's impossible," she breathed, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to maintain the pretense of composure. Her gaze flicked wildly around the room, searching for some salvation, some ally, but found only astonished guests, the senator's son staring blankly, and her Uncle Samuel's expression suspended between sorrow and judgment. "It's not," Christopher said softly, the gentleness of his voice belying the absolute finality of his words. There was no anger in his tone, no need for theatrics, only the quiet assertion of inevitability. "I bought it. I own this building. I own the house you live in, and I own the land we are standing on." His eyes met hers, unwavering, conveying the weight of moral and legal certainty. The power of someone who had acted not from vengeance, but from careful, unwavering justice. A low, stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the subtle shuffle of feet and the soft clinking of glasses left abandoned on the tables. Guests' faces reflected the magnitude of the revelation, astonishment, awe, and, in some, a small secret satisfaction at witnessing justice executed with precision and dignity. Amanda's defiance faltered as the full realization of her situation sank in. She was no longer in control. She was exposed, isolated, and powerless. Paul, standing quietly at Christopher's side, allowed himself a slow, deep exhale, relief mingling with pride. The transformation of the room mirrored the journey they had endured together, from humiliation to vindication, from patience to decisive action. His eyes, usually reserved and reflective, glimmered with the satisfaction of witnessing his son apply wisdom and restraint to effect not just justice, but a restoration of dignity. Amanda's lips parted as if to argue, to reclaim some semblance of control, but no words came. The room's energy had shifted irrevocably, every gaze a reflection of truth that could not be denied or deflected. She looked from Christopher to Paul to the crowd, and for the first time, saw herself not as the heiress or the socialite, but as someone stripped bare by their own choices, powerless against the quiet, commanding intelligence of a son and the steadfast moral compass of a father. Christopher's calm remained unshaken, his body relaxed, but his presence imposing, radiating authority that needed no aggression. In that moment, he embodied the perfect balance of compassion and justice, a man who had prepared, observed, and acted not out of rage, but out of unwavering commitment to right and truth. The room had witnessed not a public humiliation, but a masterstroke of patience, strategy, and moral clarity. And in the quiet that followed, the first whispers of admiration for Christopher and Paul began to rise, subtle, soft, yet unmistakable, marking the turning of the tide. Amanda sank into the nearest chair, the sharp click of her heels against the polished floor replaced by a hollow thud as her body gave way. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, the weight of disbelief pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. For a long moment, she simply stared at Christopher, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that could somehow undo the impossible truth he had just revealed. You bought my house?" she whispered, her voice quivering, fragile, and almost inaudible over the faint murmurs still echoing through the stunned ballroom. Christopher remained standing, composed, calm, his eyes soft yet unyielding, carrying both the authority of justice and the gentleness of a man who understood the pain of human frailty. "Technically," he said, his voice even, steady, almost conversational, "my father did." He gestured subtly toward Paul, whose presence radiated a quiet strength and an almost paternal warmth. The gesture was simple, understated, yet carried the gravity of generations, a bridge between the past and the present, between wrongs endured and justice restored. Amanda blinked, confusion and fear flickering across her features. She tried to process the enormity of the moment, the realization that the foundations of her life, the estate she had called her own, were no longer hers to command. Her hands trembled on the arms of the chair as she searched desperately for some foothold, some explanation, some loophole, yet the room offered her none. The collective gaze of the attendees, now silent and intent, bore down on her, exposing every shadow of pretense she had carried with her into this world. Christopher took a slow, deliberate step closer, his voice dropping slightly, carrying the weight of the history he was about to unveil. "Decades ago, your grandfather swindled a small plot of land from a local mechanic to build the parking lot for this estate," he said, his eyes scanning the room to ensure each word landed with precision, clarity, and consequence. He let a pause linger, allowing the audience to absorb the gravity of the revelation. Then he added, "That mechanic was my grandfather Paul's father." A stunned silence followed, deeper, heavier than any that had come before. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. The chandeliers above reflected in the polished floor like frozen constellations, casting fractured light across faces that mirrored shock, disbelief, and slowly dawning comprehension. Guests exchanged glances, whispers forming like cautious eddies around the truth now revealed. The weight of generational injustice pressed down upon them all, and yet, in that stillness, there was something else. a sense of moral restoration, subtle but undeniable. Paul stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, though not with anger or vengeance. His eyes glistened with tears, not of sorrow, but of vindication and quiet triumph. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, reflective, imbued with a lifetime of endurance and wisdom. He wasn't angry, he was affirmed. He had witnessed injustice in silence for decades, had endured slights, insults, and indignities. But now, finally, the scales were tilting toward balance. The pride in his posture was tempered by humility, the satisfaction not in domination but in rightful reclamation. Christopher continued, his tone carrying both finality and a narrative thread that tied past wrongs to present justice. "We didn't know until the title search today," he said, letting each word fall deliberately into the room. "This empire was built on land stolen from my family. Today, we just took it back." He glanced briefly at his father, a shared understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of resilience, patience, and the endurance of human dignity. The air seemed to thrum with the quiet resonance of history corrected, of wrongs addressed, of restitution achieved without malice or chaos, but with precision and morality. Amanda's eyes darted toward Samuel, the man she had relied upon, the family patriarch whose authority she had always assumed would shield her. Her voice, trembling yet edged with accusation, rose in disbelief. "Did you know?" she asked, desperation threading through her words. Samuel's gaze fell to the floor, the weight of shame and remorse pressing into his features. His voice, soft and laced with genuine regret, carried the confession of a truth long suspected but never confirmed. "I suspected," he admitted quietly. "I'm sorry, Paul. I truly am." The apology hung in the air like a fragile bridge, connecting past failures to present acknowledgement, human vulnerability acknowledged and honored. Christopher leaned slightly forward, reducing the distance between himself and Amanda, his voice calm but incisive, like a scalpel cutting through the last remnants of illusion. "So, when you told my father he should be serving the guests," his words trailed, heavy with implication, carrying the sting of irony and poetic justice. He allowed his eyes to meet hers directly, the quiet power in his gaze unwavering as he finished. "You were actually standing in his living room." The room seemed to still further, the chandelier's light now illuminating faces etched with the understanding that the world Amanda had known, and the power she had wielded with cruelty and entitlement, had been thoroughly, irrevocably dismantled. In that moment, Paul exhaled slowly, a deep, quiet release of tension accumulated over decades of injustice. Christopher's stance remained composed, steady, his voice and presence a demonstration of control and integrity. The room, once a theater of privilege and pretense, now felt like a space of reckoning and restoration. The audience, guests who had witnessed so much posturing and deception, began to process the weight of the moment, the quiet triumph of moral clarity over entitlement, the subtle satisfaction of witnessing justice tempered by empathy, not revenge. Amanda's gaze shifted across the room, landing on faces that were no longer awed by her status, but now reflected judgment, disappointment, and a reluctant admiration for the quiet force that had dismantled her world. She was alone, stripped of the trappings of power and illusions of control. Exposed not by public shaming alone, but by the undeniable truth of history, morality, and meticulous justice executed without malice. The ballroom, once a stage for her supremacy, now bore witness to a transformation that was both personal and profoundly restorative. Not just for Christopher and Paul, but for the legacy of fairness and dignity that would endure beyond this night. Amanda rose from her chair with a shuddering force, the polished floor reflecting the tension that radiated from her like heat off stone. Her hands trembled, not with uncertainty, but with the raw, unrestrained fury of a woman confronting the final unraveling of her world. The elegant folds of her white gown swirled around her as she stomped a heel, the sharp sound cutting through the stunned silence that had settled over the ballroom. Her voice, shrill and trembling, carried both desperation and defiance. "I won't leave. Squatters' rights. I have lawyers. You can't do this." She pointed at Christopher, her eyes wild, almost pleading for anyone to intervene, to reverse the irreversible. The crowd recoiled subtly, sensing the magnitude of the confrontation. Some guests murmured among themselves, uncertain whether to intervene or merely watch. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, charged with the lingering resonance of revelations and the scent of humiliation masked beneath expensive perfumes. Amanda's gaze darted frantically across the room, searching for allies, friends, her fiancé, her uncle, but their faces were calm, distant, detached. The harsh truth settled upon her. She was utterly alone. Christopher's demeanor shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. The warmth and measured patience that had guided his actions in previous hours gave way to a presence that was both formidable and commanding. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and smoothed the front of his jacket, the subtle gesture of authority signaling the finality of what was about to happen. He was no longer the conciliatory son, the calm executive exercising restraint. He was the arbiter of justice in this room, radiating a quiet, unshakable power that demanded acknowledgement. "You are trespassing on private property," he said, his voice low, measured, yet carrying the unassailable weight of authority. Every syllable resonated across the room, leaving no room for argument, no space for the defiance she attempted to muster. He allowed his eyes to meet hers, not with malice, but with the unwavering clarity of someone who had endured wrongs and now stood on the side of righteousness. "And unlike you, I treat my guests with respect, but you are no longer a guest." The words hung in the air like a physical barrier, a threshold Amanda could not cross. Her body tensed, a coiled spring of indignation and disbelief. But she could not meet the depth of calm and authority in Christopher's gaze. She opened her mouth to argue, to plead, perhaps to strike back with the sharp words she had wielded so freely in her life. Yet no retort had the strength to pierce the certainty before her. Christopher tilted his head slightly and, with the grace of one accustomed to measured power, signaled to the security guards stationed discreetly at the edges of the room. These were the very men Amanda had dismissed, insulted, and belittled countless times over the years. Yet now they stepped forward. Subtle smiles tugging at the corners of their lips, a mixture of satisfaction and calm professionalism. They flanked her with quiet authority, their presence a mirror of the accountability that had long been denied. "Please escort the lady out," Christopher commanded, his voice unwavering, delivering the finality of law and moral justice in one measured, elegant phrase. His words were not shouted, they did not demand fear, but they carried the resonance of inevitability. The ballroom held its collective breath, a suspended space in which power and truth collided, and everyone watched as consequence unfolded with precision and dignity. Amanda screamed, a high, piercing cry of outrage and disbelief, yet it fell into the controlled rhythm of inevitability. She struggled against the firm but gentle guidance of the guards, her hands flailing, fingers clawing at their uniforms, seeking leverage, seeking a way to reverse what was unavoidable. The guests stepped back, some instinctively shuddering, others watching with quiet fascination and a sense of justice fulfilled. Her eyes darted from face to face, scanning the room desperately. She searched for empathy in the eyes of her friends, for support from her fiancé, for intervention from her uncle, but found none. No one moved. No one met her gaze. The realization hit her with the cold precision of a winter wind. She was utterly, completely alone. Every ally she had assumed she possessed had vanished, leaving her to confront the consequences of her arrogance and cruelty in stark isolation. The guards guided her steadily, patiently, toward the heavy oak doors that led to the outside world. The weight of the doors, the cold brass handle, the echoing footsteps through the grand hall, all of it underscored the finality of her removal. She turned back once, a venomous glare aimed at everyone present, the audience. Christopher, Paul, Samuel, even the empty space where her fiancé had once stood in support. Every glance was a desperate attempt to reclaim control, to wield her influence, to assert some remaining claim to dominance. But the doors closed. Slowly, deliberately, they swung shut behind her, the finality accentuated by the resonant thud that echoed through the room. The cold night air pressed against her as the last barrier between her and the world she had known slammed shut. She stood there for a moment, shivering in more ways than one, as the stark reality of her isolation settled over her. The warmth of privilege, the illusions of entitlement, the safety of her social circle, all had vanished. She was left with only herself, stripped bare by the inexorable consequences of her actions. Inside, the room exhaled collectively. The tension that had gripped the air for hours dissipated slowly, replaced by the quiet murmur of reflection and the soft, tentative acknowledgement of justice served. Guests began to speak in hushed tones, acknowledging the transformation they had witnessed. The once dominant socialite had been dethroned, not with spectacle or cruelty, but with precision, patience, and moral clarity. Paul and Christopher remained at the center, their presence calm, reassuring, a testament to restraint, dignity, and the power of truth. Paul's hand brushed against his son's shoulder, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of pride and respect. Christopher's eyes scanned the room, taking in the subtle expressions of the audience, the gentle nods, the quiet glances of admiration, and he allowed himself a small, measured smile. The eviction was more than a legal act. It was the culmination of restraint, strategy, and moral authority. Amanda had been removed not merely from a building, but from the illusion of control she had long assumed was inviolable. The night had witnessed a transformation, one of justice executed with care, precision, and dignity, a testament to the triumph of patience and moral clarity over arrogance and entitlement. The tension in the grand ballroom gradually dissolved, as though the very air had been holding its breath in anticipation of justice finally being realized. At first, a single clap broke the silence, cautious, almost hesitant, as if the attendee was testing the waters, gauging whether the moment truly belonged to integrity and truth. Then another joined, followed by another, until the sound swelled like a rising tide. The applause became a wave, filling the ornate room with reverberating affirmation. It was not just the sound of hands meeting, but the resonance of recognition of courage, moral clarity, and the endurance of human dignity. Each clap carried the acknowledgement of wrongs corrected, of patience rewarded, and of a legacy of fairness finally restored. Paul, standing quietly at the center of it all, allowed the applause to wash over him. His face, composed yet lined with the subtle traces of past struggles, reflected a quiet triumph rather than triumphalism. He felt the warmth of acknowledgement ripple through the room, but more importantly, he felt the deeper satisfaction that comes from seeing integrity and patience honored in full view. Christopher, standing a step behind him, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that their plan had not merely humiliated a wrongdoer, but had reinforced the principles of justice without stooping to cruelty. The room, a space that had once vibrated with entitlement and pretense, now pulsed with an honest celebration of moral victory. Samuel approached, his expression a mixture of humility and reverence. The elder's steps were deliberate, reflective of the respect he now felt for Paul, whose composure and measured strength had not only commanded attention, but had also redefined the narrative of the evening. Samuel extended his hand, his gesture formal yet deeply sincere, infused with both regret for the past and hope for the future. "I can't undo the past, Paul," he said, his voice steady. carrying a quiet gravity that underscored his sincerity. "But I'd be honored if you'd allow me to stay on, as a junior partner." Paul's eyes softened as he looked at Samuel, seeing the remorse, the acknowledgement of mistakes, and the earnest desire to move forward. The gesture was not about power, nor was it about dominance. It was about reconciliation and the restoration of trust. He extended his own hand with warmth, a gentle firmness that conveyed both respect and the dignity that comes from enduring life's injustices with grace. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Samuel," he said, his voice imbued with patience and wisdom, "as long as they learn." There was a subtle smile that accompanied the words, a recognition that growth and redemption were possible, even for those who had faltered. As the night deepened and the final echoes of applause faded into memory, the grand ballroom emptied, leaving behind only the faint scent of roses, polished wood, and the subtle residue of champagne and celebration. The chandeliers, still aglow, reflected in the polished floors like fragments of starlight, illuminating the expansive space with gentle warmth. In this quiet aftermath, Christopher and Paul found themselves at the head table, the grandiosity of the estate juxtaposed against the simplicity of the moment they shared. They unwrapped burgers they had ordered in, the aroma of grilled meat mingling with the elegance of the room, a small, grounding touch amidst the weighty events of the evening. Christopher passed a fry to his father, a silent gesture of camaraderie and shared relief, and Paul chuckled softly, the sound carrying a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "You did good, son," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, his tone rich with both pride and tenderness. "You didn't just beat her, you outclassed her." There was a quiet laughter between them, a gentle acknowledgement that true victory need not be loud or vindictive. It could be measured, composed, and profoundly graceful. Christopher studied his father, noting the swelling on Paul's cheek finally diminishing, the subtle light in his eyes that reflected resilience and quiet triumph. "I just wanted the world to see you the way I do, Dad," he said softly, his voice carrying the deep emotional resonance of a son who had always looked up to his father's strength, patience, and dignity, like a king. Paul smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that conveyed both humility and satisfaction. "I'm no king, son," he said, his eyes sweeping the expansive estate that now stood firmly in their possession, a symbol of justice, perseverance, and moral clarity. "Just a father who is very, very proud." The simplicity of the statement belied the profound weight it carried, a testament to enduring love, unwavering integrity, and the quiet dignity of a life weathered by adversity but never broken. The two men continued to eat, the sound of their laughter and conversation filling the room with warmth, echoing against the high ceilings and ornate walls. Outside, the city lights twinkled softly, a delicate constellation of possibility and new beginnings. The estate, once a symbol of entitlement and deception, now radiated fairness and justice, a beacon for the promise of a new era. In that quiet moment, father and son shared more than a meal. They shared a legacy of dignity, moral clarity, and hope for the future. It was a reminder that patience, resilience, and integrity could outlast arrogance and cruelty. That justice executed with care and wisdom could leave the world better than it had been found. As they leaned back full of satisfaction and the gentle relief of completion, Christopher reached for his father's hand. "Here's to new beginnings," he said softly, their hands clasping in a bond of love, trust, and shared triumph. Paul squeezed his son's hand in return, a simple gesture heavy with affirmation and pride. The camera pulled back, capturing the two of them at the head table, the estate bathed in the soft glow of chandeliers and city lights, the night outside shimmering with possibility. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one marked by fairness, love, and the enduring power of human dignity. The laughter, the quiet joy, and the restoration of justice lingered in the air like a promise. A gentle but firm reminder that true legacy is built not on wealth or entitlement, but on courage, integrity, and the love that binds families across generations. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales of justice, resilience, and human triumph.